I remember clearly the very first time that I witnessed physical hunger, and it changed me. Being in a 2-room, dirt-floored home of a 7th grader, his mother, and 6 brothers and sisters stunned me and made clear to me the complacency of the church around the political and the practical issues of hunger. This scene, right in the center of Knoxville, made me wonder how we could help with such enormous need. It caused compassion to well up in me that said, surely we, being the church, we must do something. This immediacy and this image of hunger surged back into my mind as I read and reread our gospel lesson today, this familiar story. The story of Jesus, of course, is commonly known as the feeding of the 5,000. There were 5,000 men, but there were also women and children. So these were multitudes of people on that day. We know the plot. We know the story. The need is great, but resources are ridiculously inadequate. Finding a solution to this presenting problem is so remote that the disciples just begin by admitting defeat. We can't. It would simply cost too much. And then we seem to hear, wait, here's a bit of food, a very little bit, but someone actually has some food. Then Jesus, who clearly intends for people to be fed, takes that very little bit of bread. He blesses it and begins sharing it with those who are hungry. I can see him beginning to look into the faces of hungry people and giving it out bit by bit until all are fed. And then the fragments, the leftovers, could feed many more. Bread, we know, is a central image in this story and in the stories to come in this lectionary cycle. In fact, I'm warning you, we're going to have bread sermons for about 4 weeks here. So bread is a central image in this story. And of course, it's a central metaphor for sustaining and sustainable life. Bread is a staple for human survival, and it's a product of human work. Bread is that which satisfies hunger. And it represents all that nourishes us and sustains life: spiritual food, emotional support, economic well-being. Bread is a symbol for it all. That's one central image in the story. The other central image in the story, I believe, is the gift of the boys' lunch that makes this story, this miracle, if you will, possible. He brought only enough for himself, but he combined it somehow with trust and generosity in sharing his bread. Now, we know that some people just take this story literally and simply call it a miracle of Jesus. But for most of us here, I would say that we don't really have a need to take it literally. It isn't a story that's really literally plausible for us. Magical multiplication of a ridiculously small amount of food to feed thousands of people with masses left over. We probably couldn't wrap our head around it. But we may hear in this story an urgent call to attend to the needs of hunger, the needs of our century, of our community. Many of you know that we have had to close the ministry that we had in this community called Neighbors in Need. What do we do now? There are hungry people still among us. Times were tough for those on that mountainside so far away with Jesus, too. Deep in debt, many had been evicted from their own land by their oppressive government and were living in poverty and, yes, hunger. Some may have been hired as laborers on what was once their own land. Others may have resorted to begging and stealing in the city. They were hungry for food and for hope. So when they heard about Jesus' compassion, his acts of healing, they began following him, chasing him down, if you will, because they were desperate, desperately hungry. So this is a story about need, and it's a story about Jesus' response in the face of that desperate need. His response may matter to us today for several reasons. First is, I believe it demonstrates the attitude and action of God in regard to those around us who hunger and thirst. Literally, hunger and thirst. Jesus' action makes the concern of God for bodies, for physicality, clear. Secondly, Jesus models for those who follow him a compassionate response, a response that cares for people's dignity as well as their bodies. Jesus sees and responds to this primary human need. Additionally, this story may reveal something of a mystery, something of a miracle about compassionate action. We could call it, I suppose, the principle of multiplication. When something is given, it somehow becomes more than it is. You may know what I'm talking about. When there's an act of compassion or generosity, many may be served or healed or fed. We may recognize something of a Eucharistic tone in Jesus' breaking of the bread. In fact, many of you have said, "Oh, are we having communion this morning?" Well, sort of. But so the story says this. So Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he broke them and distributed them to all who were gathered. What does that sound like? It sounds like communion to us. We may also be reminded of how God fed the wandering Israelites in the wilderness with manna from heaven. But this is neither manna nor communion. Jesus is doing something different here. Of course, we can look back. We can look back on this story and recognize the same compassion from Jesus, the same giving that brings him to that table with his friends much later in his story. But those gathered that day, I believe, did have a holy, sacramental experience on that mountainside. They saw Jesus take and multiply those simple, small gifts. They felt Christ's compassion and care. When all were fed, when hunger was relieved, they may have realized what God could do for them, what God could do through the least of them. As with so many stories of Jesus, this is also, I believe, a social story, a political story. It's a story that has an economics base. It's a story where hope is found in community. At the outset of the story, Jesus' comrades make a simple, clear statement. No way can we afford to feed all these people. And yet, the needs are right before them. The needs are imminent. These people will be hungry if they aren't already, and Jesus intends to see that they are fed. All they have is a youngster and a lunch for one, but this child becomes the sole partner with Jesus in feeding the hungry. Let me say it again. The child becomes a partner with Jesus in feeding the hungry. Because of what he brings to this table, God's compassion is known. The provision that they need can be realized. Now, we all know that we can't know exactly what happened here. Did Jesus really kind of work magic on the food? Did the boy's generosity transform others' hearts? Did some also have a little bit of bread or cheese or olives with them, but were hesitant to share, fearful that they wouldn't have enough for themselves? Perhaps when they saw the boy give his lunch and they witnessed the blessing of Jesus, how Jesus received it, thought it was actually something, then maybe they were inspired to offer up theirs as well. It doesn't matter that we don't know exactly what happened, because the point, I believe, is clear. Even when one without much to give actually does it, actually reaches down and gives what he has, resources are multiplied and many are fed. In giving what we have, we become partners with Christ to manifest the compassion and generosity of God in this time and place. When we join to address the needs around us with hope and generosity, hungry people can be fed. So, how might this story shape our action in this place, transform our ideas, inspire us with ways to use our own resources in the face of our communities and the world's great need? First, we must grasp the importance, I think we already do, of Jesus' attention to the actual physical needs of people. People are hungry. We know people are spiritually hungry, and people are physically hungry. We've heard the statistics this morning. And Jesus cared that they were hungry politically, hungry to have a renewed place in the society. That is, they needed to feel like they had the power to change things, the power to change their own lives and the lives of those in their community. They were hungry for bread and for agency, and Jesus addresses both. He focuses on the need and the resources, however slight they might be, that they had among them. I wonder if we could participate in this mystery and miracle of multiplication, of feeding the hungry. I wonder if we could see ourselves as the child with the loaves and fish. Not much, but when he brought what he had, and when he gave it in service of a common need, everyone had enough, and there was food left over. You see, the boy had the power to change everything because of the little that he had. Do we get that this morning? Those who were fed didn't exactly get it. They chalked it all up to Jesus and started a movement to crown him king. Of course they did. He did something pretty promising in a tough economic climate. But Jesus did what he did other times. He slipped out the back because they missed the point. The point is not that Jesus is the new food truck. Rather, the point for them and for us is that they can be, we can all be, those who take what we have and bring it to the table so that those in need can find help and so that equality might be achieved. Every one of us, even the smallest and most vulnerable among us, can bring something, bread and grace and hope and attention, just noticing hungry people. In our current political and economic climate, following Christ's example in the practical act of sharing and providing bread for the hungry feels so important, like a relevant act of worship that we can do every day. Could we feed those who are hungry if we each, even with our relatively small contributions, bring what we have? If we really knew and believed that nothing is too small or insignificant, does the story convince us of that? If we believed that what we can do, from bringing literal food to those who are hungry, to offering our time to help others, it would be so stunning that we just might call that a miracle too. Would we eagerly begin? Jesus shows us how to create the miracle of caring community by bringing what we have, each of us. That's how it works. Ethnomusicologist Bernice Johnson Reagan, who began that wonderful group Sweet Honey in the Rock, tells the story of that well-known freedom song, We Shall Overcome. In its original form in the black church, which is where it began, the song was, I shall overcome. Bernice Johnson Reagan said it was only when the white folks got hold of it that they made it, we shall overcome. She goes on to explain that in African American community where the song was originally sung, there's an understanding that it takes the I. That each of us needs to realize our own power and our own agency in making change for something to become a plural reality. She contrasts this with the general perception that it takes saying we to bring us all in. She explains further, she says this, saying that we are going to have a potluck dinner doesn't create anything. But when someone says, I'll bring fried chicken, and another says, I'll make my special peach pie. When everyone says, I will, then all will be fed. So freedom can happen when I can overcome, and you can overcome, and you can overcome, and you can overcome. Then all come to that table of liberation and can eat together. If each of us brings our share of food and time and gift and voice, of compassion and commitment and nurturing others, we will all be fed, be nurtured, have enough. We will be strong and hopeful and encouraged, and we'll have baskets full of all those things to give to others. Just this week, I read news statistics revealing that 22% of American children live in poverty. Wrap your head around it. It's up 1 percentage point every year since 2008. And these rates, 22%, these rates are double in African and Native American communities and are the very most severe in the South. Most often, this means, as Ted pointed out, substandard education, poor learning among our students, and this code word, it means food insecurity. The prophet Isaiah speaks for Yahweh. The worship I choose is to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to share your bread with the hungry. If you offer your food to the hungry, the prophet continues, and satisfy the needs of those afflicted, then what will happen? Then your light, the light of God in you and in us, then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and you shall be a spring of water, whose waters will never fail. What is God calling to your attention this morning? How will we respond? What do you have? What bread is in your cupboard? Physical, spiritual, nurturing support for children? What is yours to bring to the table and share? If we each bring what we have, then something that we just might call a miracle can happen in us and among us and in this community where, yes, people are hungry. We're going to sing together. Jim and I will sing the stanzas, and I invite you to sing if you share your bread with the hungry together. As you do, some gifts might just come your way. If someone shares their bread with you, take and eat. May we all be fed. May the baskets of our lives and of this community be filled to overflowing, so that we may share with those in need. Amen.